Okay, I think this is where our recording will officially start. So once again, if you are just joining in, welcome to Supporting Students in Our New Reality. My name is Marissa Thompson. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. And today we're really going to talk about the ways that COVID-19 pandemic has affected young people and how this might affect our youth exchanges moving forward. So a little bit of background about me. I want to do a quick disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. I am not a mental health professional. I do not have a therapy license or a counseling license. However, I was a teacher through it in a K-8 school for about a year, actually through a grant that the state of Illinois granted for schools to support students coming back to in-person learning. My official title at the time was student support specialist. So I was kind of along one of the first interventions for student mental health at the school. And while I was there for about a year, I noticed a couple kind of alarming things. So some things that stood out to me while working with youth were that a lot of students had difficulty managing their emotions or had a hard time reacting to certain big emotions or events. I also noticed that students were struggling to interact with their peers and other adults and socialize face to face. We'll talk a little bit more about that through our webinar today. A rise in reported depression and anxiety. I'm sure we're all familiar with the youth mental health crisis that is going on now. Definitely something that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. An increase in reported issues at home and attendance problems across all grade levels. So we're noticing chronic absenteeism, and it's very hard for these students to show up when they're needed to. And so we know that the pandemic had a huge toll on our students through isolation and not being able to see their friends or participate in their usual activities. And I also want to point out that we were living through a couple major historical events as well, right? No matter where you were in the world, there were issues of political unrest, especially here in the United States. We dealt with a lot of racial tension and police brutality. And these were all issues that we could see live happening through our smartphones at any time while we were isolated in our home. So it really created kind of a distressing environment for students. And in a study done by the Centers of Disease Control, found that more than a third of high school students reported they experienced poor mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. And 44% reported they persistently felt sad or hopeless during the past year. And that sad or hopeless part is very concerning. We know that these are some of the definitions that are required for depression. And if we aren't giving students the right tools or interventions, it can become a mental health crisis. And I just want to quickly touch on that while these are Centers for Disease Control, so more American-based statistics, I do feel like they could apply pretty much globally, right? And we'll talk about kind of more global in a minute. So here is a statistic that stood out to me when I was doing research for this webinar. And this comes from a survey done by UNICEF during the first year of the pandemic. And they found that 73% of students that took this survey felt the need to ask for help concerning their physical and mental well-being. Despite this, 40% of students did not ask for help. So I want us to take a minute, kind of absorb that information, and I want us to maybe come up with a few ideas of why students would not ask for help, even if they knew that they needed it. One really big one that I discussed a lot with my students did have to do with the stigmatization of mental health. Especially some of my students were younger men, and to them it felt emasculating to have discussions surrounding mental health, or it kind of seemed something that only girls talked about. So I know that could be one potential barrier. I'm saying in the chat, it'd make them feel weak, societal stigma, peer pressure, definitely. These are all very valid barriers that exist for young people for asking for help or receiving help. Someone said afraid that they might get sent home, that they would be embarrassed. They're trying to be strong and put on a face for other people. Actually, these are all good reasons that a student might face a barrier asking for help. There's also issues with even just access, whether that be financial or transportation. You know, my parents don't have the time or the money to take me to therapy if I needed it. Yeah. Then maybe they don't have somebody that they can trust. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I want to keep these potential barriers kind of in mind as we move forward through the rest of the webinar. So one thing that we have to consider is, even though I've talked to lots of youth exchange leaders when I was at NAN to kind of get a better understanding of what the application and interviewing process looks like. And for a lot of you, it's a pretty robust system that in the past has been a really good way of kind of weeding out successful youth exchange candidates. But something to consider is, even through our screening processes, students that didn't have diagnosed mental health needs can still experience a mental health crisis while they are on exchange. And we might know there might be pressures to lie during the application process, because if youth exchange is something they're really passionate about, maybe they don't want to be honest about some of the struggles that they deal with. And in this new normal, in my opinion, it is safer to assume that youth will experience a mental health crisis than not. So maybe we can just sit with that for a minute and absorb that, to know that a lot of these kids are struggling. Even kids that we might have pre-pandemic deemed as successful youth exchange students still might be having a hard time. We know that the pandemic has impacted our students. In its simplest terms, trauma is what happens when an event challenges a person's ability to cope and changes the way we live our day-to-day life. Unfortunately, the bad news is that trauma literally and physically affects our brain. It affects the way that we react to certain issues, how well we can deal with stressors. However, the good news is that our brains can be very adaptable and resilient if we are given the right tools to recover. So again, trying to frame this as, this is something that has physically impacted our young students' brains and the way that they operate in this new normal. And that being said, we might have some pre-pandemic expectations while we exist in this post-pandemic, mid-pandemic reality. And this is not to say that these expectations are wrong or based in something that is untrue, but saying that some of these policies or rules that we've put in place might not have the same intended outcomes as they did before. So for example, no contact policies during exchange. And this was a rule that was implemented in order to help students assimilate into their culture and actually have a better experience while on exchange. And this helped people adjust to their new host culture and family. When in reality, no contact policies could leave some students feeling isolated and depressed. You know, they just spent the last few years not being able to talk to their close friends and family. And now they might be in a new country and they feel like they're slipping into that isolation again. Or for example, it was expected, you know, most exchange students will attend school regularly, show up to class, and be there without disruption, where in this new reality, students may experience disruption in their in-person or school events for whatever reason. Or that students are outgoing and social and enjoy spending their free time with their host family. But social skills and willingness to connect, we know, has suffered significantly due to lockdowns and virtual schooling. So again, not to say that any of these potential expectations are wrong or misguided in any way, but it is definitely something to consider that these were maybe the expectations we had pre-pandemic, and now post-pandemic, with how these young people's brains are operating, we might not be getting the same outcome that we had been previously expecting out of some of these policies and rules. So I want to take a moment to consider, and if you don't feel comfortable sharing, that is totally okay, but you can think about this internally. Would love to hear from you in the chat. Why do you do youth exchange? It is a very tough job. For many of you, it probably feels like a second job. That is a volunteer position. And I'm just curious, I would like to hear, why do you do youth exchange? What does it mean to you? Changes students' lives. Yeah, definitely. Hope for peace through understanding. You were a youth exchange student. You know firsthand the effects and the good that youth exchange does. Definitely. Gain a global perspective. I think that is fantastic. I had the absolute wonderful privilege to connect with some of you at NAIN, and it was very inspiring to hear your reasons for doing youth exchange and what that means for you. Somebody says I get a lot out of it for myself, not just for the student, but also what you get out of doing youth exchange is definitely something that I want to touch on. So I want to take a moment and acknowledge that while this pandemic has traumatized our youth, right? It is something that changes the way that we live our day-to-day life. It challenges the way that we cope and adapt. That means all of us have shared the collective trauma of living through this pandemic. And this means that the pandemic has also affected you. And we still do not fully understand the ways in which the pandemic has affected us just yet, but we know that it has to some capacity. All of this to say that RI has received reports of club and district morale being low, or districts having difficult time finding host families, nevertheless, enthusiastic host families, and feeling overall unhappy and dissatisfied with the exchanges. We've even had reports of, one student having a pretty bad exchange, getting sent home early, and it almost kind of sounded like that was the end of youth exchange for that district. And I want to take a moment and acknowledge that the work that you do is so important, and it can be a very challenging and difficult job to do. And that is why I want to take a moment and make sure that we are giving ourselves grace and patience during this time and not using youth exchange as a measure of our own success, right? Knowing that if you do the best that you can to support these students and it still doesn't work out, you are still a valuable and wonderful part of the youth exchange team. And that's just something that I wanted to remind everyone of here, because unfortunately we are seeing a trend in youth exchanges that some are not successful. And again, wanting to make sure that we are not using youth exchange as a form of external validation, which can happen consciously or unconsciously. So the new normal, talking about smartphones and social media use. My big kind of mantra for 2023, the new year for me, has been two things can be true at once, right? I believe that this is a good view to have because it allows you to look into the nuance of some issues that might be more complicated than just black or white. I feel like this is an issue we experience in the media as well, that we all know that situations are a little bit more gray. So this was something that I found interesting. I don't really have an answer or a solution, but just something that I wanted to discuss. Again, a case of two things can be true at once, is that I found in a survey of teens, 53% credited social media as very important to keeping them connected to their friends and family. And among 14 to 22-year-olds, 43% said social media helped them feel better when they were depressed, stressed, or anxious. So on one hand, we have an incredible tool in our pocket that can find information within seconds. So students can use their smartphone to watch a guided meditation video on YouTube. There are deep breathing exercises for anxiety on TikTok, or you can discover self-care plans, fun workout plans on Instagram. So there are a lot of really great resources that can be done through our phones and our social media apps. However, on the flip side, research shows that the youth mental health crisis was a long time coming, but it's become supercharged due to the use of smartphone and social media. And we know that this has damaging effects on our youth, and it leads to increased mental health distress, self-harm, and suicidal ideation among youth. So we have these two truths, right? That smartphones can be a really great tool and resource for helping youth feel connected and be a part of communities and help them get access to great resources. But on the same time, we know that it can be harmful in some capacity. Actually, this happened to me the other day. I went to go grocery shopping and I accidentally left my phone at home. And I literally was 5 minutes away, but it felt very jarring and very distressing for me to be out in public without my phone. So again, I don't have great answers to maybe what the best meeting in the middle is, but understanding that these truths do exist. So how can we kind of start to navigate perhaps some of these intricacies or nuance? The big takeaway from this webinar is about finding balance, and that is so much easier said than done. I can say find balance, but what that will mean will really be on a case-by-case and individual basis. We definitely have some strategies and some talking points that we think will be helpful while finding balance, and that can include working with a student support network to build trust and cooperation. So another thing that we've noticed in some of our reports is that there seems to be interference between youth exchange students and their parents, and that seems to put maybe a rift in the students' youth exchange experience. I think that we can all agree that when somebody does sign up for youth exchange, right, we all are on the student's team to make sure that they have the best exchange possible. So if we can find ways to work with the students' parents and guardians and to find communication plans that work where everyone feels supported and connected without disrupting the exchange, that might be a good place to start so that a lot of people feel supported and confident. Another really great thing to do if you're not already is involving your Rotary Youth Exchange alum or other young people in the youth exchange process. I'm a big fan of the saying, nothing about us without us. And when you bring youth into that planning and the programming, it does really bring a really fresh and great perspective into some of maybe the orientations or the interview process. And I know that is something that a lot of you are already doing, but if you aren't, maybe something to consider. And the last point I want to talk about is acknowledging that in our new normal, sometimes the priority will be the student's well-being and not so much being a Rotary cultural ambassador. And what I mean when I say that is that there will be a day, could be a week, or even a month where a student is on exchange and they just might be feeling out of their element. They might be going through a mental health challenge where it will be most important to support the student during that time, and maybe not making sure that they're making their Rotary Club meetings or things like that. Of course, we do not want this to become the expectation or normalized behavior, but recognizing there may be times when the student's mental health and well-being will come first before anything else. And I know that a lot of you already do an incredible job of supporting your students on exchange, but this is something to extra keep in mind as we move forward within this new normal. So the next kind of half of our webinar today, we'll be talking about building a toolkit. And this is kind of like a mental health resource toolkit. I did this with my students when I was teaching. We did this over about a semester, so they had about 10 weeks to learn a lot more in depth about coping skills and maybe social cues and things like that. But the whole point of a toolkit is that we can empower youth to feel confident to handle some of these challenges on their own, or to feel confident enough when a challenge arises to know where to reach out for help. So this can be a literal physical kit if you would like to make it. Many of the times it was kind of something more on paper or something that we would write down. There are many things that you can do to add into a toolkit, but for the sake of time today, we're going to be talking about 3 important steps that I think should be involved in the toolkit, and that includes identifying trusted adults, creating a coping skill plan, and creating a communication plan. And the toolkit is something that should be revisited throughout the students' exchange program because sometimes these items might change. So we're going to go in depth into each part of this toolkit. First, I want to talk about trusted adults. I'm sure that you are probably a trusted adult to at least one youth already. And trusted adults are essential for any young person's support system, especially now more than ever. Trusted adults are essential in young people feeling confident, feeling safe, feeling secure in any challenge that they may encounter because they know that they have a trusted adult to turn to ask questions, to feel open and to not be judged. Often, trusted adults are close family. So especially when you're a young person, it's probably your mom or your dad. Maybe you have a grandpa or an aunt that's really close to you. And of course, it is our hope that through the exchange, the student will build their trusted adult support network, right? They don't get rid of mom and dad, but they have found a trusted adult within their host mom, or maybe their outbound coordinator. And one thing I want to acknowledge is that it is okay if you are not the student's trusted adult, right? So what's important is that we really just find the trusted adult that works for this student. And I say this because there might be for the first 2 weeks, the student may not have a trusted adult in their new host country, even though there are adults that are trustworthy, right? It takes time to build these relationships. And not to say that if you notice the student is texting mom or dad for the first couple of weeks of their exchange, we know that historically that actually increases feelings of isolation and homesickness. But for the student, this might be their only trusted adult at this time who can help them deal with some of these feelings of homesickness. And of course, again, something that we don't want to make a habit or make the new normal is always reaching home to mom and dad. But just acknowledging that for a while, it could just be mom and dad until we start building these relationships with other trusted adults. Creating a coping skill plan. So the keyword being plan here, because of course we want a plan in place before we reach a student feeling very overwhelmed or a student saying, I want to go home, right? We want to have these available long before the student even gets on an airplane. So something to consider is that this should be worked on before the student leaves, and it should be something that goes with them to their host district, right? Their host family should be involved, their counselor should be involved. And again, this is to empower the student to feel confident enough to handle some of these challenges while on their own. So as we know, feelings of anxiety, being homesick or overwhelmed are very, very normal parts of the youth exchange experience. Especially culture shock plays into a big part of some of these feelings. But the good news is that if we use emotional coping skills, these can help ease the intensity of an emotion, temporarily distract, or help tolerate stressors better. And when we're feeling very overwhelmed, the thinking part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, literally does not work the way that it's meant to, right? If we're under a lot of stress or we're feeling a lot of anxiety and feeling overwhelmed, we might do or say things that do not reflect our best self, right? So it's very important to make sure that we have coping skills ready and available for if we do reach that point. Another thing to consider is that students also might not have the proper vocabulary to communicate their emotions and feelings, which can be a very frustrating process for young people. So sometimes it's difficult for young people to talk about how they're feeling, but it could be easier for them to just do an activity to let out their feelings. And so I want us to keep in mind that everyone is different, right? So a coping skill that works for me may not work for you. And from a social emotional learning lens, coping skills can include things like I just need a night to isolate myself in my room, or I need a night where I just play video games, right? These may have been things that we perceived as historically negative. However, are positive coping skills if done correctly, which I'm going to talk about now. Um, so again, from a social emotional learning lens, distractions can be healthy. Distractions can provide that brain break that our prefrontal cortex might need if we're under a lot of stress or feeling overwhelmed. However, there is a difference between distraction and avoidance. Distractions can offer a really much needed brain break, where avoidance is not helpful and teaches us that we cannot cope with challenges. Um, and the big difference between a distraction versus avoidance is setting intentions and setting those boundaries collaboratively, right? So let's say, for example, there's a student on exchange who is having a really difficult time in school, and they're working on their French homework and they're becoming very overwhelmed, right? So being a good distraction would be setting an intention and a boundary, letting your host mom know, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed with my French homework. Um, I just need a brain break for a minute. I'm going to take an hour. I'm going to play my video game, and then I'm going to come back after that hour and finish my homework. And this, again, sets the intention. I'm going to do this for a well-needed break, with the boundary of letting your host mom know, and that, this is just a time when I need a break, and this isn't going to be something that happens every single night. Okie dokie. First, I would love to hear from all of you, maybe some coping skill ideas of your own that you would add to this list. This is a list that I created with my 7th and 8th grade students, of coping skills that they came up with. So I told my students to come up with a list of 10 and then choose 5 that they felt were actually very feasible and doable. Um, so take a minute. Please take a minute to look at this list. Let me know in the chat if there is anything that you might add as well. Let's see. Yes, I can send you these in a PDF as well. I'll make this presentation available. Someone said, connecting with another exchange student. That is an awesome one. Watching YouTube videos about cruising and interesting places to visit. I love that. I'll watch like house tours on YouTube. But definitely, so we can all probably come up with some coping skills of our own. But again, the hope is that we have these in place even before the student leaves for their exchange. So if a student is very outdoorsy and enjoys nature, maybe connecting with their host parent even before they go on exchange to say, hey, my student, when they're overwhelmed, they really like to go for nature walks. Is this something that you think you could help them out with? Is there a walking path near your house? Or maybe the student is very artistically inclined, right? Maybe artwork is very therapeutic for them. So either sending the student on exchange with an art kit or maybe making sure that their host family has one available for them when they get there. So again, maybe choosing 10, but then 5 realistic ones that you can do even if you're in the house by yourself. Coping skills, again, are a very important way to help regulate our emotions. And I called it the green zone with my little kids. Get you back to the green zone where you're feeling regulated, you feel like you're in control of your emotions again. And some of these, again, you don't necessarily need equipment or anything. You can do inside, making a long list of things that you're grateful for, reading a book, using positive self-talk. These are all really great coping skill ideas to share with some students. So when I would talk to my kiddos, I would talk about the 3 most beneficial coping skills, or the 3 most beneficial types, excuse me. And that includes self-care is one of the biggest ones that I put on the list. We know that our mind and our body are very connected. So if we are not physically feeling great, we usually don't mentally feel great either. So it's very important that these students are getting enough sleep, taking care of their personal hygiene, eating enough nutritious food, and staying active while they're on their exchange. Because while that doesn't necessarily solve anyone's mental health problems or challenges, it definitely makes a big difference. The second one is engaging in hobbies. Hobbies are essential for young people to feel fulfilled and have a sense of purpose. And again, these hobbies can look different to different people depending on the situation. Some people's hobbies are sports, some people's hobbies are reality TV and keeping up with people on, Twitter. So it looks different for everyone, but hobbies are very important for self-fulfillment. And the last one, being communicating. And again, this was a big problem that I noticed when I was teaching in the schools, was that young people had a really hard time communicating with other people, but also having kind of that internal conversation with themselves. Especially difficult time communicating with adults, but we're going to talk about maybe some skills that youth can use, but also something that we can do to help facilitate communication with youth better. So some advice I would have regarding communication planning is identifying who a youth can turn to when they need to talk to somebody and creating essentially an address book. I know you might automatically be assuming that's the role of the counselor, which yes, that is a big important part of their role. But like I said, when it comes to trusted adults, we can't just choose who a young person's trusted adult might be. They have to build this relationship over time. Maybe it's a student who has questions about their menstrual cycle. They may not feel comfortable talking to their counselor about that, but they may feel comfortable talking to their host mom. So kind of creating a list to say, who would you turn to if you needed help with school? Who would you turn to if you needed help with relationships? And kind of create this address book so the student feels empowered that if they do have an issue, they can contact some of these people and maybe not, immediately call home to mom and dad. Also, it's important to find our best practices to communicate with youth. I know that sometimes face-to-face might be difficult or impossible given the situation, but what is important is keeping that open line of communication constant. So that could be through WhatsApp, maybe a Facebook group for your club. I just know that if I asked like some of my students to email with me, they'd be like, "Oh, what is email?" So kind of meeting them in the middle, figure out the best way to communicate with them. And what's really important to youth is knowing that consistency, right? Knowing that if I message you on WhatsApp, I'll probably hear from you tomorrow afternoon at the latest. So just letting them know that you have that open line of communication is very important. Following up with that also is expectation setting. It's important to stay consistent. And I know that a lot of you do a really excellent job with this at your orientation. You might also be inviting Rotex in to kind of let them know what the expectations will be or what their exchange will look like. And that is all to say that it's also important that we remain consistent. Right now, for young people, having plans change feels like rejection, and that can feel very upsetting for young people. So trying to stay consistent as possible with our expectations with youth is very important. And of course, speaking with students instead of at them. I mainly worked with the middle school students, and these kids they know way more than we think that they do. They are very, very smart, and they are very open to having dialogues and conversations about why, if we allow them the space to. I had an interaction with a student. They wanted to use my classroom when I was going to be gone for a day, and I just said no. And they kind of had an attitude about it. But when I sat down and I gave them a chance to ask why, I explained to them it's not safe if I'm not in the classroom. We've unfortunately had incidents in the past where people are doing things that they're not supposed to in a classroom without a teacher. I gave them that space to explain why, and it seemed to make sense to them. So please offer them that chance as well if you aren't already. And conflict resolution. So I'm sure that you all are probably conflict resolution experts. You probably had to flex your skills already at some point this year. But if we also give youth these conflict resolution tools, again, we can empower them to maybe take care of some of these challenges within their exchange, again, instead of calling home to mom and dad or wanting to leave immediately. So this is the kind of the basic. There's many other ways to do conflict resolution. This is what I taught my students, is first and foremost, trying to understand the other side. We want to listen to understand and not listen to respond. And of course, that means that we are not listening just to get our side of the story out, but understanding that if we're coming together to do conflict resolution, we want to know all sides, including both parties. We want to also affirm what the other person is saying. Again, even if we might think that it's silly, right? It's been a big enough deal to come to have a conversation together. So it's important that we listen to understand and we affirm. And use I feel statements. At least in the English language, I feel statements are a really fantastic way to focus on feelings and not accusations, right? So if we can focus on feelings and kind of the root cause of the problem, we can find solutions instead of playing blame games. So that might look like, for an example, a student goes on exchange. They really want to go to a party at a friend's house on a Friday night, and their host family just says, I'm not comfortable with that. The student could have an honest conversation instead of saying, you never let me do anything, you never let me leave the house or have friends. That's not a very productive conversation. Instead, the student can say, hey, I'm feeling left out at school, and I thought this party would be a really great way for me to connect with students. Can we talk about why you didn't want me to go to the party? So again, I feel taking responsibility for our own emotions, and that way we can get to the bottom of the problem instead of accusing each other. This can also be a really great tool to teach to host families as well. So for example, you might have a student that's been staying in their bedroom a lot. The host mom might say, instead of saying, you never want to be with our family, you disrespect us, the host mom could say, I feel very disappointed that you didn't want to join our family dinner. Can we talk about why you stayed in your room all last night? So I feel statements, very, very important. Let me know if you have any other maybe tips or tricks when having these difficult conversations. Then, of course, accepting responsibility where necessary and compromising and finding a solution, right? That's the whole point of getting together to have a conversation, to do conflict resolution, is that the hope is that no one leaves feeling like the winner or the loser. It's that we hope that both people can come together and have a shared understanding and compromise. So the main thing that we are here to do today, and I know that I'm in a webinar with all the right people to do this, is that we are trying to empower our youth through our youth exchange program. And again, I want to emphasize that the pandemic has impacted us all in ways that we really fully don't understand just yet. So again, that includes you, it includes me, it includes young people for sure and their brain development. But I really believe that through the programs that you put on, we can build resiliency into our programs and empower youth to feel confident in themselves while on exchange, right? If we can give them the tools to be successful, they can become a little bit more self-reliant and not want to go home early or not want to call home to mom and dad immediately, as long as we can work together to help build these skills. And overall, I wanted to give a big thank you for all the hard work that all of you put into your programming to make sure that these students have amazing experiences. It was such a privilege to be at NAN and to hear so many of the successful youth exchange stories that you have, I'm sure, thousands, hundreds of. But again, I want us to walk away here without not forgetting about how important the work that you do, and it's important that you take care of yourself and hold a little extra grace and patience for yourself. And then once you do that, right, that's kind of what they say on the airplanes. You have to take care of yourself before you can assist other people. And then take some of that grace and patience that you've allowed yourself and also extend it to our students as we all navigate this new normal together. So I want to take a moment. I'll probably maybe read some of these chats, but I would like to hear from all of you in the chat box. Maybe what are some of the common issues you're experiencing through your youth exchange program? And then if anyone has any helpful tips or things that they've implemented into their programs to be helpful, please let us know. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'm looking at some comments. I just want to answer a few questions. Yes, a copy of this PowerPoint as well as a recording will be made available to everyone who has registered. So please be on the lookout for that. I'm seeing folks talk about difficulty in securing host families and outbound candidates, as well as finding host clubs within the district, recruitment, club support, definitely. So hopefully you can all also take a minute to look through this chat. If you relate to maybe some of the struggles that some folks are having, let people know, that way that they know that they're not alone. And if you have solutions or maybe tips or things that have worked out for you for some of these folks' problems that they're having, please let us know. Excellent. Yes. So while definitely I can understand wanting to make sure that we have host families for these students, um, this is supporting our students in our new reality. Hopefully this is something that maybe resources like the directory can assist with. Um, so please, again, make sure that you're utilizing these resources. Students spend a lot of time on their cell phones, definitely, and I think that's part of the new normal, right? Maybe previously exchanges, there's a lot harder to contact, parents and friends back at home, but now it's a lot easier and a lot more accessible. Excellent. Thank you all so much for the conversations that are happening in the chat. It was my original intention to have this webinar be kind of more of an open discussion, but with so many people registered, I still appreciate your participation in the chat. Or yeah, we might even be having issues with students being interested in joining the program post-pandemic, right? I'm going to see if any of my colleagues on the call would like to say anything. I believe they have hosting permission or talking permission. Yes. Okay. I see a comment about challenges in the host home and how coping skill plans should be shared between student and the host family. That is definitely a really important part of the puzzle, is making sure that everyone is on board with this coping skill plan, right? If you have a student who their favorite coping skill is playing video games, again, this might have been something that historically we found to be pretty negative or, not helpful. So if this is not communicated correctly to the host family, this can be seen as a negative or isolating behavior. So again, that's why it's so important for this coping skill plan. It's done before the exchange and it is shared to everyone who is a part of this student's exchange. I'm seeing a lot of good tips being shared in the chat as well. I also have a question. How do you establish some of the expectations of your exchange students before they go on exchange? Is this at orientation? Is this a part of the application process? Please let me know. I'm very curious. And then additionally, what are your host family expectations? Ooh, I have a question that says, do we have access to an online conflict resolution training course that the students can use? Let me check in about that. I feel like that would be a really amazing resource. Maybe what are your expectations for your inbound students for while they are abroad? Is that a part of your training and orientation? Okay, John says we discuss expectations with students during orientation, and utilizing the ROTEX are an excellent resource for leading these expectation discussions. That is excellent. We love to see that. So I'm also wondering if maybe, for example, you have expectations regarding language acquisition, how quickly you think that they should be assimilating, how much free time they should be spending with their families. Let me know. And again, if that is a part of your orientation process. Oh, great. Okay, Drake has a resource regarding conflict training. That would be excellent to share. What a great resource. Alrighty, feel free to continue chatting in the chat box while we kind of wrap up with only a few minutes left. So here are my sources if anyone was interested. And again, a big thank you for being here and for all the work that you do for the Rotary Youth Exchange program. It would not be possible with incredible volunteers like yourself. And please, again, we are here as staff members to be a resource for you at all times. So if you don't have access to the online reporting form or to the directory or the GPI survey, please email youthexchange@rotary.org, and we are more than happy to help get you connected to these resources, or if you have any questions or concerns in general, we are more than happy to help. Yes. Thank you all so very much for being here. Again, a recording will be made available as well as the PowerPoint to everyone who has registered. So if you know somebody who couldn't make it today, We will be sending an email out, so be sure to keep a lookout for that. Also, let us know, email youthexchange@rotary.org if you are not currently connected to the Rotary Youth Exchange news and updates email newsletters. That is also a really great place to look for some of these resources. So once again, thank you all so much for being here. Very much appreciate your thoughts, your participation. I'm glad that I wish this could have been a more open discussion, but I'm very open to hearing your thoughts and opinions. So please let us know if you have any questions, concerns. Please email us, and have a fantastic rest of your day, or for some of you who it's late, good night. And again, please let us know if you need anything. Goodbye.